If you still think the goal is to make more money, then you are still standing inside the wrong game. That is the first thing I would tell you. The second thing is harder. Most people do not stay financially ordinary because they lack talent, effort, or opportunity. They stay ordinary because they built a life that keeps pulling every new dollar back down to earth before it can become freedom. That is the real trap, not low income alone. Gravity, bills, lifestyle, impulse, comparison, identity noise, and the constant emotional need to turn money into proof that you are doing okay. That is what keeps people stuck. I learned this more slowly than I should have. When I was young, I did what a lot of ambitious people do. I thought wealth meant one thing above all else: more income, more assets, more good decisions, more gains, more visible progress. But if you are not careful, more becomes one of the most expensive words in the English language. Because if every increase in income simply finances a more expensive version of the same dependence, then you are not building freedom, you are feeding a larger machine. That is why I think the central idea in your source document is far more powerful than its surface format. On the surface, it offers 9 habits underneath. It is making a much sharper argument. The real objective is not to get rich for the sake of status, but to use money to reach financial escape velocity. The point where life no longer drags you back into constant forced earning. Fay Felicite Fay turn 50, file 0 Fay. That is the line worth building around, escape velocity. I like that phrase because it is mechanical, not emotional. It tells the truth. A rocket does not negotiate with gravity. It overcomes it. And most people never do that with money. They keep earning, but they do not escape. They keep improving, but they do not escape. They keep consuming, rewarding, upgrading, justifying, but they do not escape. They remain in orbit around obligation. That is the life most people call normal. I call it expensive gravity. The source file defines it beautifully. It says that if your investments never become strong enough to cover your life, then bills, pressure, and lifestyle will keep pulling you back into the game of having to make money forever. Fay Felicite Fay turn 50 file 0 Fay. That is exactly right. And once you accept that, almost every money decision changes. You stop asking, can I afford this? You start asking, does this move me toward escape velocity or back toward gravity? That is a much better question, because the truth is that most people are not mainly trying to get free. They are trying to look successful while staying trapped. That is why their financial lives feel so active and so fruitless at the same time. Now, I want to rebuild the whole source document around one continuous line. Money is not the goal. Freedom is the goal. Money is the fuel, the tool, the machinery, and the stored force that can move you there if you stop using it to decorate the cage you are trying to escape. The source says this directly in one of its strongest early sections. It argues that money should be treated like a tool, not a purpose, and that when people worship money itself, they often lose the life they were supposedly trying to build with it. Fay Felicite Fay turn 50 file 0 Fay. That is one of the deepest truths in all of personal finance. A hammer is useful because of what it helps you build. Money is the same. If you start worshiping the hammer, you stop asking what house it was meant to construct. That is what happens to many high earners. They keep asking how to make more. They stop asking what kind of life they are actually trying to buy themselves out of. And if you do not answer that question, more money will not rescue you. It will just enlarge your confusion. I have met many people with enormous incomes and very little real freedom. They can spend, they can signal, they can travel, they can upgrade, but they cannot stop. Their lifestyle is too large. Their identity is too tied to performance. Their business owns them, their schedule owns them, their self-worth rises and falls with the month. The source document says something very important here. It notes that money solves money problems, but it does not solve purposelessness, stress, or insecurity by itself. It simply amplifies the person and life structure already there. Fay Felicite Fay turn 50 file 0 Fay. Exactly. A rich anxious person is still anxious. A rich hollow person is still hollow. A rich status addict is still a status addict. That is why money must be subordinated to a larger design. Otherwise, it becomes a scoreboard that controls you instead of a tool that serves you. So if I were rebuilding this entire philosophy as a Buffett-style operating system, I would say it begins with one inversion. Stop trying to make money your destination. Start trying to make money your escape engine. That sounds subtle. It changes everything. Because the moment money becomes an escape engine, your spending changes, your priorities change, your tolerance for comparison changes, your attitude toward raises changes, your relationship to time changes, and your relationship to your own identity changes. Now let us move into the first habit beneath that idea. Build your life around freedom, not things. The source document begins there too, and it is wise to do so. It asks what money is actually for, then argues that most people treat money as something for buying, upgrading, and looking successful, when in fact its highest use is purchasing the ability to need money less over time. Fay file a site, Fay turn 50 file 0. Fay, I think that is exactly right. And I would sharpen it further. Every dollar that enters your life is asking one question: will I become comfort now, or freedom later? The problem is that comfort is visible and immediate. Freedom is silent and delayed. A nicer apartment can be seen tonight. A bigger portfolio cannot be felt for years. A better car gets applause now. A larger investment contribution disappears into the future with no one cheering. That is why so few people choose freedom consistently. Their nervous system is built to reward visible proof. Freedom asks for invisible loyalty. This is where the real separation begins. The ordinary person earns more and expands the present. The serious person earns more and expands the future. That is a brutal difference, because the two people can look almost identical for 5 or 10 years. Then one day they are not the same kind of person anymore. One still needs the machine. The other has begun building a life that can one day walk away from it. That is why I always say the gap matters more than the income. The gap between what you earn and what you need is the tunnel through which freedom enters. Protect that gap and you are building something. Erase that gap with every upgrade and you are financing a better decorated form of dependence. The source keeps returning to this escape velocity idea, and one of its strongest lines is that the goal is not really to make more money forever, but to build investments that eventually pay for your life so that you no longer have to stay in the game. Fay file site, Fay turn 50 file 0 Fay yes. That is the win. Not one more raise, not one more visible symbol, not one more temporary proof. The win is to need the game less. Now let me go to the second habit, because once you understand freedom as the target, the next question becomes practical. How do you stop depending on mood? The source document answers that cleanly. It says to automate your investing before you ever see the money, because discipline fades, temptation arrives, and next month almost never comes. It argues that the best investors make investing a system, not a decision they must remake each month. Fay file site, Fay turn 50 file 0 Fay. This is one of the most adult principles in the whole piece, because the great enemy of financial progress is not ignorance alone. It is repeated voting. Every month you ask the present version of yourself whether the future version still deserves protection. Some months the answer is yes. Then you are tired, stressed, envious, bored, tempted, and suddenly the monthly vote goes against the future. That is no way to build wealth. A serious adult removes the vote. The money arrives. A portion disappears immediately into investments. No speech, no inner negotiation, no heroic self-image. Just process. The reason automation works is not that it is clever. It is that it bypasses your weakest moments. And your weakest moments are what normally get sold expensive things. The financial industry and the consumer economy both understand this better than most households do. They know that emotion, convenience, speed, and small amounts of friction determine behavior. That is why stores reduce friction to almost nothing. One click, saved card, familiar app, fast checkout. Little delay between wanting and having automation simply takes that same logic and uses it for your side instead of against you. The money moves before you can claim it emotionally. That is not a trick. That is governance. The source says if you don't see the money, you don't miss the money. And while that sounds simple, it points to a deep truth about how human attention really works. Fay file site, Fay turn 50 file 0 Fay. Exactly. Most financial weakness is not grand weakness. It is visual weakness. Money looks available, so it feels available, then it becomes spent. A better system makes the money unavailable by default, and that one design choice can change a life. Now let us move to the third habit, live below your means, especially when your means improve. This is where almost everyone who should be getting ahead quietly remains ordinary. The source document makes the point with unusual force. It says wealth is built in the gap between what you earn and what you spend, and that many people destroy that gap every time income rises by immediately upgrading housing, cars, subscriptions, and status consumption. It even tells a story of a business owner who generated huge profits and then went bankrupt because his lifestyle expanded just as quickly. Fay file a site, Fay turn 50 file 0 Fay. That is one of the cleanest laws in money. You do not get rich because income rises. You get rich because spending refuses to rise as fast. The gap is where the machine begins. A raise is a test. Most people think it is a reward. And rewards are dangerous because they recruit the most emotionally persuasive word in finance, deserve. I deserve a better apartment now. I deserve a nicer car now. I deserve more ease now. Perhaps. The question is not whether you deserve it. The question is what future is being postponed to buy it. That is the adult question, and almost nobody is trained to ask it with enough seriousness. The source document wisely suggests keeping lifestyle roughly the same for a few years after a jump in income. Fe file site, fe turn 50 file, 0 fe good. That is exactly how you convert income into force rather than into vanity. Hold the line. Let the rays accumulate underneath the old life. Then the machine starts forming. Then later, if you want to expand a little from strength rather than from impulse, you can do it from a higher base. That is intelligent living. Now let us go to one of the most corrosive habits in the modern world, comparison. The source document is direct about this too. It says social media makes everyone look richer, more ahead, more successful, more upgraded, and more complete than you, even though what you are really seeing is mostly spending and performance rather than actual net worth. Fe file site, fe turn 50 file 0 fe. That is exactly right. Comparison is one of the most efficient ways to destroy quiet wealth. Not because it changes your income, because it changes your emotional baseline. A good life begins to look insufficient. Steady progress begins to look slow. Restraint begins to feel like losing. And once that happens, the spending decisions that follow are no longer about utility. They are about relief. A better car is no longer transportation. It is a sedative. A vacation is no longer rest. It is proof. A luxury purchase is no longer enjoyment. It is self-rescue from the feeling of being behind. That is what makes comparison so financially toxic. It turns the whole market into therapy. And therapy through consumption is one of the most expensive habits on earth. The source document says something very important here. Most people are not showing their net worth. They are showing their spending. Fe file a site, fe turn 50 file 0 fe. That sentence should be tattooed on the inside of the financial mind. Because once you really believe it, much of the spell breaks. A spending display is not strength. It may be debt, it may be stress, it may be insecurity with better lighting, it may be wealth, yes. But wealth itself usually does not need to shout. Quiet wealth is called quiet for a reason. It does not need witnesses in order to exist. That is why comparison must be treated as a real economic threat, not just a bad emotion. It changes spending, risk, patience, and self-worth all at once. And that takes us to the next habit. Track your spending with humiliating honesty. The source document says most people think they know where their money goes until they really look. It argues that awareness is the turning point because money does not disappear mysteriously. It gets spent unconsciously. It recommends simple tracking tools and gives an example of someone discovering hundreds of dollars a month were vanishing into a single routine retailer without any awareness. Fe file site, fe turn 50 file 0 fe. That is the right lesson. Money leaks through places you stop noticing, and what you do not notice you cannot govern. Most people are not poor because of one spectacular purchase. They are poor because of uninspected drift, 100 here, 50 there, a recurring bill nobody revisited, a food habit that became identity, a convenience pattern treated as necessity, a subscription life so layered that no one knows what the monthly burn really is anymore. That is why visibility matters. Not because spreadsheets are beautiful, because reality is expensive when you refuse to look at it. I used to watch my bank balances obsessively when I was young, not because I enjoyed anxiety, but because the act of looking kept the numbers real. The source document tells a story in that spirit too. It says that once the author started watching balances closely, the experience moved from anxiety toward control as the numbers began rising under better behavior. Fe file a site, fe turn 50 file 0 fe. That is an important transformation. The point of tracking is not guilt. The point is power. What you can see, you can redirect. What you do not see will keep governing you from the shadows. The next habit is related but deeper. Track net worth. Not just monthly survival. The source document separates these two ideas and insists that if you do not know what you own, what you owe, and whether the total number is actually moving, you are guessing. It says tracking creates clarity and clarity creates better decisions. Fe file site, fe turn 50 file 0 fe. This is a profound point. A person can feel busy financially and still be going nowhere. Bills paid, salary earned, accounts active, life in motion. And the net worth line remains flat because the entire system is circular. Money comes in, money goes out. Nothing compounds, nothing accumulates, nothing escapes. That is a sophisticated form of stagnation. Tracking net worth is important because it asks a brutal question. The monthly paycheck does not. Is the structure actually improving? Not. Do I feel okay this month? Not. Did I make enough to keep the machine running this cycle? Number is the total claim on my future getting stronger or not? That is the question wealth cares about. The source document says, what you track, you improve. And that is one of the oldest truths in performance. Fay-Filocyte Fay-Turn 50 File 0 Fay-Wealth is no exception. Not because the number is magic, because the number tells you whether your habits are turning into capital or evaporating into lifestyle. Now we arrive at one of the most difficult and most important habits of all, detach self-worth from money. The source document is unusually good here. It says many people do not merely want money. They want what they think money means. Status, validation, proof, enoughness. It warns that when your identity is tied to income, money stops being a tool and starts controlling your emotions and decisions. Fay-Filocyte Fay-Turn 50 File 0 Fay, that is one of the deepest traps of adulthood, because if money equals identity, then every financial decision becomes emotionally distorted. You spend to defend the self, you earn to defend the self, you compare to defend the self, you fear losses because losses do not feel like lost dollars. They feel like diminished worth. That is why so many successful people remain miserable around money. They are not using money, they are being used by it. This is especially dangerous for high performers, business owners, and anyone whose self-image became fused with output. The source document says even very successful entrepreneurs often do not know how to leave the business because their business has become their identity. Fay-Filocyte Fay-Turn 50 File 0 Fay, exactly. And if identity and income are welded together, then freedom becomes impossible because the machine is no longer only paying you, it is telling you who you are. That is why detachment is not spiritual fluff. It is financial infrastructure. When money stops defining you, it stops controlling you, then you can make long decisions instead of ego decisions. You can choose the useful car instead of the validating one. You can invest the raise instead of announcing it with purchases. You can say no to status games because they no longer feel necessary to protect the self. That is a massive advantage. Now let us go to the last great habit in the source. Think in decades, not days. The source document closes there, and it is exactly the right place to close. It says real wealth is built slowly, consistently, and quietly over years and decades, not through fast outcomes or dramatic transformations. It even uses the seed and tree metaphor to emphasize that digging up the seed every day to check progress only destroys the thing you want to grow. Fay-Filocyte Fay-Turn 50 File 0 Fay, that is one of the oldest truths in investing and one of the least emotionally respected. People say they understand the long term, then they behave like days are decisive. They want proof this week, validation this month, a jump this quarter. Otherwise, the process feels dead. That is why so many people never get rich quietly. They cannot tolerate invisible years. The first stage of wealth is unimpressive. That is the insult you save, invest, restrain, track, wait. And the early numbers still look too small to justify the inner effort. That is where almost everybody turns back. Not because the process failed, because the process refused to flatter them early. The adult investor learns something crucial. Silence is not failure. Flat-looking early progress is not failure. Boredom is not failure. What matters is whether the machine is real. If the machine is real, the years will eventually do what the moods cannot. That is why I prefer the decade frame. A decade protects you from emotional stupidity. A decade protects you from comparison. A decade protects you from the temptation to judge a tree by its first season. A decade is where escape velocity becomes visible. Now let me step back and tell you what I think this whole philosophy amounts to. Quiet wealth is not built by one brilliant investment. It is built by reducing drag, reducing comparison, reducing complexity, reducing emotional spending, reducing identity costs, reducing the number of places money leaks away before it becomes capital, then routing the saved force into assets, automation, and time. That is the full system. And what is remarkable is how unromantic it is. No luck, no stress, no genius required first. Not because life is easy, because many of the heaviest chains are self-installed and can be removed one link at a time. That is why I like the title of your source document more than most titles in this genre. It is not promising theatrical wealth, it is promising quiet wealth, wealth built through systems, detachment, restraint, and a longer frame. Fay-Filocyte Fay-Turn 50 File 0 Fay, that is exactly the right promise. Because loud wealth is unstable. Quiet wealth is durable. Loud wealth needs witnesses. Quiet wealth needs structure. Loud wealth wants to be seen. Quiet wealth wants to work. The public does not like this because it sounds too simple. Simple is offensive when people are addicted to drama, but simple is often what survives. The person with fewer obligations, lower comparison, automated investing, controlled lifestyle expansion, visible spending, visible net worth, detached self-worth, and a decade frame is living in a different economy from the person who only earns and reacts. That is the truth. The difference is not money alone. The difference is system quality and systems compound. That is why two people with the same salary can live radically different financial lives. One is feeding gravity, one is building escape velocity. Now let me leave you with the image I think matters most. Imagine two rockets on the launch pad, both receive fuel, both look powerful, but one keeps burning its fuel to light up the launch tower, impress the crowd, and make the ground around it feel important. The other directs the fuel into one-purpose escape. After enough time, the difference is absolute. One is still on the ground looking expensive. The other is gone. That is the whole game, and that is the contract I would make with my future self. I will build my life around freedom, not things. I will treat money as a tool, not a god. I will automate investing before emotion can recruit my paycheck. I will protect the gap when income rises. I will refuse to compare my path with other people's spending. I will track where every dollar goes and whether my total position is actually improving. I will separate my worth from my income. I will think in decades, not days, and I will remember that quiet wealth is not the result of one giant move. It is what happens when you stop feeding a hungry life and start directing your money toward a calmer, leaner, freer one that finally gives the future more claim on your income than the present does. That is how you get rich without luck. That is how you get rich without stress. And that is how you stop playing the game before the game uses up the best years you had to give it.